Hello there and welcome to J Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this here channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, obviously. Sometimes it's tips and tricks for new armies, sometimes it's book reviews, painting tutorials, a retrospect on the hobby and how it's evolved over the years, and occasionally a drunken explain. There's something here for absolutely everyone. And for today's video, we're talking all about secondary objectives, which is a big thing in 40k. It's one of those interesting things where it very much feels like a lot of people don't really know how to approach them. So today's video is going to be all about how to pick your secondaries and what you should take into consideration when you do so. So unlike a lot of other ways of looking at armies and things in 40k, when it comes to secondaries, it's not necessarily about going this army should have this secondary or that army should have that secondary, but we'll get into all that in a second. And for today's video, we'll be painting this model right here. Yes, I know, not a secondary model at all. Sorry, that was terrible. But in any case, let's crack on. So the important thing to remember about secondary objectives in 40k is they're not really secondary, so to speak. Yes, I know that's blisteringly obvious, but it's worth saying up front before we get too far into it. The first thing I want to say about secondaries is that whilst they may be called secondaries, they are probably as important, if not more important, than your primary objectives, simply because you have far more control over them than you would do with your primary objectives. Primary objectives within missions don't change, whereas you have total control over your secondaries, or at the very least you have total control over the ones you do choose to take. And there are three things that this all boils down to when it comes to your secondaries. The first thing is the strengths of your army, so the things that you consider your army to be particularly good at doing. The composition of your opponent's army, so if they are heavy in certain things, that can be exploited with your secondaries, which we'll get to later. Then of course there's the mission itself. Some missions have secondaries that are easier to accomplish than others due to the deployment zone and the actual placing of the objectives themselves. And the last thing to bear in mind is that secondaries, because you take them from different categories, some of them can pair up really rather well. So you can take certain secondaries from one category and certain secondaries from another category, and you will actually find yourself a winning combination having to do minimal work. But we'll get to all that later on. For now, let's start off with the Battlefield Supremacy secondary objectives. Yes, the ones from Grand Tournament 2021 are, as we all know, engage on all fronts, behind enemy lines, and stranglehold. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of all three of these, it's just worth remembering that those are the ones that you have in that category, and all three of them rely largely on placement on the battlefield itself. Now, unlike the other secondaries on this list, the thing about Battlefield Supremacy is that they are reliant on quite a few things in order to be able to be pulled off. And the first thing is you need speed and either survivability or numbers. Now, not every army is built to have speed necessarily, especially if you're playing Space Marine Castle, and if you do that, you know who you are. And I think it's worth keeping in mind at this point that if your army isn't built for speed, then Battlefield Supremacy can sometimes be quite difficult to achieve early on. Ultimately, people want to start scoring secondaries in turn 1 if they can, and not be waiting until turn 2, turn 3 to start scoring them the way they are with primaries. Now, when it comes to talking about things like engaging all fronts and behind enemy lines, these ones are slightly more straightforward to take hold of, simply because they require you just to be in certain parts of the board. But with Stranglehold, you need to have both objective control and control over the board itself, which makes it a lot harder to do, especially if you're facing a tricky opponent who's dug in quite well to their position. And the other thing you have to remember about the Battlefield Supremacy secondaries is they may not always necessarily line up particularly well with where the primaries are placed. So again, with the exception of Stranglehold in this case, in this respect it's largely about being in certain table quarters, on certain deployment zones, and there may not always be that many objectives in those parts of the board, so that's something to bear in mind. And ultimately, if you want to get this, the best way to achieve any sort of Battlefield Supremacy objective, especially things like behind enemy lines, is probably not to have your object secure units doing that, because you'll either want them on your primaries or on your opponent's primaries as quickly as possible. So just to quickly recap that, Battlefield Supremacy, whilst being very achievable, you need to have speed and you need to have survivability to do it. It's best to keep an eye on the mission you're playing before you commit to any of these to make sure you can actually achieve it and not feel like you're going to be straying too far or be too exposed from your primaries. And if you are going to go with this one, it's best to make sure that it's not your OBSEC units that are going for it either. Cool. This brings us on to the second category, no mercy, no respite. And the first one for this one is no prisoners, which, just to remind you all, is the one where you kill as many models as possible that aren't vehicles, monsters or characters. Divide that number by 10 and that's how many points you get. Now, it goes without saying that this one is not particularly worth taking if you're not playing an opponent with a Horde army, simply because the moment you're playing armies like Space Marines or even Orcs in this day and age, and a lot of people do play smaller, more elite armies, if you're basing your secondaries on your potential kill tally and you can't kill more than 20 to 30 models, then you will have a very, very small number of secondary points from the result of taking this one. It can work out slightly sometimes if you do know that your opponent is going to be taking a substantially large army, but even then that's not a guarantee, so most people don't really see no prisoners. And sadly, in the days of 9th edition, we don't see many Horde armies anyway, so it's not surprising we don't see this one much to begin with. Then this brings me on to Grind Them Down. Grind Them Down is a very good one. It's a very straightforward one as well. All you have to do is kill more enemies in the battle round, then they kill of yours. But it's very easy to be wrong-footed by this one, and I'll tell you why. Whilst this one is quite good for smaller armies, it does of course mean that later in the game, when units start to get weakened and start to lose numbers and characters start to take wounds, it's very easy and very quick to start seeing your army overall losing units relatively quickly. And the other thing you have to remember is that it's over the entire battle round, not just your turn. So you can kill 3 or 4 things in your battle round, and your opponent in their battle round can kill 5, especially if they are already in combat at the beginning of their turn, or vice versa. So sometimes you can even save yourself this one as well a little bit if you're able to get a combat hit off or finish off a unit that's already in combat with you from their turn, meaning that this one is quite a balanced one to take because it literally could swing either way, but ultimately it's one to keep in mind is going to be more useful to you if you know that you've got more offensive ability than your opponent does, or you can bring your offensive ability to your opponents without having to sacrifice too much of your board control for your primaries. And then, of course, this actually is very well related to the last objective in this category as well. So, to the last is the simple one, your 3 most expensive units in your army. You get 5 points for each of those that survive. Now, this is great if you're playing something like Imperial Knights or Chaos Knights, or armies that have lots of Lords of War, or lots of units that have super heavy, and it's a fantastic one to take for them. For the rest of us, this one can be a bit harder to look at as being a positive, because it's reliant on you being able to keep expensive units alive for the entirety of the game. However, it's worth saying that in a smaller game, around about 1,000 points, then it can actually be quite a good one to take, because more often than not, your most expensive model is going to be either your Warlord or one of your more elite units, which you're probably going to be able to keep alive by dint of the fact it's an elite unit in the small game anyway. So that is something to bear in mind. And also, this is probably the only one where you can actually tailor your army list in order to fit it in, where you can place your points and allocate them to units where you need them to be in order to keep prices in certain units that you can keep hidden. And if you can find a way to make if there is a way to make your most expensive units in your army also able to hide at the back of the board and not lose too much of your offensive ability from it, then that is fantastic. But most armies, unfortunately, have their expensive units front and center because they tend to be their most effective. This one doesn't work out so well for Death Guard as a side note, just because Plague Marines tend to be quite expensive, weirdly enough, the most expensive unit in the army sometimes, and as a result, it's a big risk taking them as your secondary to keep them alive, when dying is one of the things they will definitely be doing. And yes, guys, Death Guard Plague Marines can actually die. Who knew? So just to quickly sum up on No Mercy, No Respite. No prisoners, great if you're fighting against a horde, but otherwise leave it alone, and unless you know people who are playing hordes, then you won't be seeing it very often anyway. Grind Them Down is probably the most balanced of all of these secondaries in the game, but be very wary if you and your opponent take it, because you're both going to be out for each other in a slightly more proactive way than you would be otherwise. And lastly, to the last, fantastic if you have a small army anyway, and if you can find a way to keep your expensive units subtly hidden away, more power to you. Otherwise, it's probably best to look elsewhere. And then this brings me on to the Shadow Operations. The Shadow Operations were ones which are new to 9th edition and haven't really been seen in 40k before. So as a result, it's one of those secondaries categories that a lot of people I don't think really knew what to make of it when it first arrived, but has been received very well since. And let's start off with one of the most common secondaries I see, Raise the Banners High. Yes, Raise the Banners, that one which every Marine player uses, because it's a very good one to double down on your OBSEC units with and your primaries, which is another great thing. If you can find ways to have your secondaries and primaries come together, then it does do a lot for your army. It does, however, put you in a slightly defensive played mindset, because you have to hold those objectives in order to keep scoring points on them, whereas if you just need the objective for now and then you can move off to the next one next turn, that's a different story entirely. However, it's also worth bearing in mind that Raise the Banners is a very useful one to have if you've also got smaller armies or small elite armies, simply because all you have to do is have your OBSEC sitting in one place and keep accruing points. But obviously this one works even better if you can pair it up with engage in all fronts, just because objectives tend to be in different table quarters, and if you remember that one from the battlefield supremacy section, it's a very good way to start doubling or even tripling points in some case, because all it means that you'll have to do is just sit in certain parts of the board and accrue maybe upwards of 11 points per turn, which is absolutely fantastic if you can get that off. Now, the next one up is Investigate Signal. Now, Investigate Signal is probably one of the rarer seen ones, just because it's the action you only get points for if you're in the middle of the battlefield and your opponent doesn't have anything in the middle of the battlefield. Like I said, this can be one which can be interesting if you're playing a game with objectives that isn't in the middle of the battlefield, but otherwise it can be quite tricky to make work if there is a central objective, or even if your opponent is particularly eager to get to the middle of the board for whatever reason. However, if the objectives are more around the edges rather than in the middle, then this could be a good one if you have a unit spare to go into the middle of the board and start performing actions, and you're confident that your opponent isn't going to start diverting fire to them. And thankfully, this is one of those ones where you get to the end of your turn, not necessarily at the end of the battle round, which is always quite a good one. And then this brings me on to a newer comer to us, Retrieve Octarius data. Now this one's all about table quarters and is another action which thankfully you get in your turn as well. And obviously you get it for each table quarter you're in. So just like Engage in all fronts, if you can get this one to line up, and even behind enemy lines for that matter, if you can get them to line up, then you can suddenly start scoring multiple victory points. But again, in order to get Retrieve Octarius data, you have to be in different table quarters and be further away from other table quarters. So this one can take a little bit of time to achieve, and obviously if you've got primaries that you want to score, then it's quite important to bear in mind that this one you're only going to get if you're able to spare units to go off into other deployment zones, into other parts of the board, where you are going to be able to use them to rack up those victory points without them either getting killed, and if you don't need their offensive abilities in combat that turn. So this one does require a little bit of planning, simply because you need to be able to move quickly, and you need to make sure that you're not going to need them somewhere else to get the most out of that unit. The other thing to remember is this one only maxes out at 12 points, so if you're confident you can get the full 15 somewhere else, then it may be worthwhile looking somewhere else if you want to maybe rack up those points elsewhere. And then this brings me on to Deploy Teleport Homer, which is the last one in this category here. Now this is a really interesting one, simply because you can do it with bikes as well as infantry. And one thing I probably should say very quickly right now is that the only infantry can perform actions in most of these, not even and not characters. They cannot perform actions. So that's something else to bear in mind, is that you will always be using infantry. But ultimately, most armies have plenty of infantry, so I don't think you have to use your object secure units to get this. Sometimes you can use it for other things. You can even use Space Marine Scouts, you can use Mandrakes, you can use Mega Knobs if you really want. If you're that confident of victory, then be my guest. But anyway, back to this now. So this one, Deployment Teleport Homer, is simple. You perform the action, but this one takes a whole turn. So it's not until your next command phase that it's considered to be complete. And you get 2 victory points if you're within 12 inches of your opponent's deployment zone, but you get 4 if you're in their deployment zone. Now that's really important to bear in mind, because if you can get into your opponent's deployment zone, then that's 4 victory points that they could potentially start. This does of course make that specific unit a massive target, and if your opponent gets into combat with you, then that action is automatically failed. But if you have a fast army with things such as bikes or flyers, or units that can fly, that can hide themselves behind cover and keep out of sight or out of range, then this could be a really good one to frustrate your opponent, because then they will have to divert their fire and they will have to divert the direction of their movement in order to deal with you. So whilst the unit itself may end up getting killed, it's a very good secondary in order for a hey look over there distraction to stop your opponent from maybe taking the rest of your force. Just something to think about it. And the other thing to remember is that because it can be achieved with bikes, it's a little bit easier to be achieved early on, just because you have speed on your side. And that's really, really important. Now, this brings me on to looking at all of them together in terms of who will do them best. Now, earlier on, I said that taking different secondaries from different groups and pairing them up can be really, really good. And I'd probably say that the Shadow Operations and the Battlefield Supremacy secondaries do that quite well. Behind enemy lines and Retrieve Octarius data, or behind enemy lines and Deploy the Teleport Homer, can all be very good secondaries to pair if you have speed, and just like Raise the Banners, Engage in all fronts can also work quite well together, simply because you're then only having to do one thing to get double the amount of points that you would otherwise get. But anyway, this brings me on to Purge the Enemy, another one in the kill your opponents category of getting victory points. Now this one is split into 3, Assassination, Titan Hunter, and Bring It Down. And this one, again, is very straightforward in terms of what you've got. So it's either 3 points for killing characters for Assassination, And then 4 points, up to 9, up to 15 for killing Titanic units, which again, obviously, if you're fighting knights or lots of super heavies, and then bring it down, which is all about killing vehicles, which we'll get to in a second. Now, those first two, Assassination and Titan Hunter, are very straightforward and don't really bear much more going into it. If your opponent has more than 3 characters, Assassination is probably always a good shout, because characters, even some of the more powerful ones, don't tend to have more than 7 or 8 wounds, and weaker characters can have as little as 3 wounds, which makes them very easy targets to take out. Titan Hunter, again, if you're playing an army which is Imperial Knights, no-brainer, always take it. Bring it down is where it gets interesting, simply because of the points you get. And it's worth remembering that if your opponent has lots of vehicles, this may at first seem like a really obvious one to take. You only get 1 point if the vehicle has less than 10 wounds. If we look over at armies such as Drakari and Harlequins, and even Eldar, there are lots of light vehicles that have less than 6 or 7 wounds that can really quickly turn into a swarm. But killing them, if that's all they have, then that will only net you about 3 or 4 victory points. Whereas looking at Imperial Guard with their Leman Russes and their Hellhounds and even Sentinel Squadrons would be a much better yield of victory points there, even though they are far more heavily armoured. And this is what I meant earlier on when I was talking about pairing your secondaries and keeping an eye on your opponent's army composition. If they do have an excess of characters or an excess of vehicles, these are the secondaries that will let you exploit that. Even if they are powerful, then if you can change your strategy to take into consideration that they are there, then that can be quite fruitfully rewarding for you as a player. So just to quickly sum up so far on that one, Purge the enemy, Assassination if they've got more than 3 characters, always worth taking. Titan Hunter doesn't take any more explanation, although it's worth mentioning that if they have Demon Primarchs, then that can also be quite a good one to take if you're really stuck. And bring it down, obviously. Keep an eye on which vehicles they have or which monsters they're running, I should also say, and it can be very useful for your army to keep in mind there. And this brings me on to my last group of secondaries, which is Warpcraft. Warpcraft, Warpcraft, Warpcraft. Now, for most people, they don't even look at this one, and to be fair, there's only a handful of armies that can really make much out of it, and that is Demons, Grey Knights, Tyranids, Thousand Suns, and arguably Astra Militarum, and maybe Death Guard. Because the majority of these are entirely reliant upon your opponent or you having lots of Psyker units that can be exploited. Again, this comes down to what your army is either very good at or not very good at. And a lot of the psychic actions that you can take with your army are going to be requiring you to sacrifice potential offensive or unit buffing capabilities from the rest of your army. So Warpcraft is not something that I would expect a Space Marine player to be taking with a Space Marine Librarian, and I wouldn't be expecting Chaos Marines or even Eldar technically to be taking them with their relatively few number of sorcerers. And I say Eldar because they don't put out as many psychic abilities as they used to. If you use a psychic action, you can't use any more of your psychic powers, and that's something which is really important to bear in mind. There is one exception to all of this, and that is Psychic Interrogation, which all you need to do is use one of your characters to cast a single psychic action that is Warp Charge 4, and you can cast it on any character for 3 victory points each turn. Now that one might be a little bit more appealing if you've only got 1 or 2 Psykers and you're confident that your psychic abilities inherent to your army may or may not net you much of a benefit at any one turn, so it's one that's worth keeping in mind. So that's the one exception I would give to the rule. So just to very quickly recap on that, Warpcraft secondaries are better only for armies such as Demons, Grey Knights, Tyranids, Thousand Suns, and other armies that can take a large number of Psykers, or by you if you know your opponent is taking a large number of Psykers, like those armies I just stated there. And because of this, it's maybe not going to be anyone's go-to, but it's worth keeping an eye out for Psychic Interrogation just in case there is an opportunity to use it in the future. So those are the 5 categories of secondary objectives. And how does this all work together? Well, I wouldn't say that any one army has any obvious choices, even though there are a few obvious considerations to be taken. If you're playing against Imperial Knights, then you'll want to take Titan Hunters, and if you're playing Imperial Knights, then you're probably going to want to take to the last or grind them down. But I think it's always worth remembering that multiple secondaries are a way to go, and most armies have secondaries written into their codexes in 9th edition, so you will have a small number of unique secondaries to you that your opponent may not be able to access. which always gives you an ever so slight edge in terms of how you achieve them. And the other thing to bear in mind is if you can pair them up, like I said, by pairing things from No Mercy, No Respite with Purge the Enemy, or pairing things from Battlefield Supremacy to the Shadow Operations, then that does give you quite a lot to work with, and it does give you some mileage in how you accomplish your secondaries. And the ultimate thing to remember about secondary objectives on the whole is that because you have control over the ones you pick, it does mean that you shouldn't stress out about which ones to pick. Only look at the ones that you know your army can exploit the strengths of, and not the ones your army can't exploit if they aren't able to. But as always, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about secondaries? Do you think they should be more varied? Do you think the secondaries and the way I've described them would be helpful? Do you think there are other ways to use the secondaries? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. Secondaries and how you should inform your choice of secondaries and what will work well at what times. But I hope you all found this useful, and if you have any thoughts, then please do leave them in the comments below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shitty stuff, and also check out my website for the services I provide. See my Patreon if you want to support my Patreon if you want to support this channel, and if you want to just look at some pictures of toy soldiers, my Instagram is down there too. And keep an eye out for my eBay affiliate link down there as well, in case you want to get some models from an absolutely fantastic company. But thank you all again very, very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.